In the final desperate winter of World War II, the conflict was supposed to be winding down. The German war machine was battered and retreating on all fronts. But Adolf Hitler had one last insane gamble to play. A thunderous surprise offensive through the frozen Ardennes forest, aimed at shattering the Allied lines and forcing a negotiated peace. It would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, a fight defined by brutal winter conditions and incredible heroism. But hidden inside this epic struggle is another story. The story of a top-secret piece of technology, an artillery shell so advanced it had never been used on a battlefield before. And it's the story of an American colonel who, facing annihilation, would defy direct orders to unleash this weapon, changing not just the course of the battle, but the very nature of warfare itself. On December 16, 1944, Hitler unleashed his final gamble. American soldiers in the Ardennes were outgunned, outnumbered, and caught completely by surprise. The earth trembled under the weight of hundreds of Panzer tanks. But on one critical sector of the front, an American colonel was about to make a decision that would echo through history. He was about to defy a direct order from the highest levels of command and unleash a weapon so secret the Germans wouldn't know what hit them. For soldiers who had survived years of war by digging in, their foxholes were about to become their graves. This is the story of the intelligent shell that broke Hitler's last army and changed warfare forever. By late 1944, the Allies were sure the end was in sight. After D-Day and the breakout from Normandy, their armies had pushed all the way to the German border. The front lines had settled along a quiet forested region called the Ardennes. This sector was considered so unsuited for a major attack that it was used as a rest area for exhausted American troops and a training ground for new ones. That was exactly the weakness Hitler planned to exploit. He gathered the last of his reserves, over 200,000 soldiers, and nearly 1,000 tanks for a massive surprise attack surnamed Watch on the Rhine. The plan was audacious. Smash through the thin American lines, race to the Meuse River, and then seize the critical port of Antwerp. Capturing Antwerp would cut off supply lines for nearly a third of the Allied forces, trapping them, and, in Hitler's mind, forcing a surrender. The attack was launched under the cover of the worst winter weather in decades. Thick fog and heavy snow grounded the Allies' single greatest advantage, their total air supremacy. On the ground, the German assault was overwhelming. Elite SS Panzer divisions, spearheaded by monstrous Tiger II tanks, slammed into unsuspecting American infantry. The U.S. 28th and 106th Infantry Divisions were shattered in the opening hours, with thousands killed or captured. The situation was dire. Communications were cut. Units were surrounded. A massive bulge began to form in the American lines as German spearheads pushed deeper and deeper. For the GS in their frozen foxholes, it seemed like an unstoppable tide. They were facing veteran German troops, experts in winter warfare. The trees of the Ardennes, which should have offered cover, now seemed to only mask the enemy's advance. Every report reaching Allied high command painted a picture of chaos and impending disaster. The Allies were facing their greatest crisis on the Western Front since 1940. They needed a miracle. Unbeknownst to almost everyone, that miracle was sitting in ammunition depots just behind the front lines, locked away under the highest secrecy. 4 pivotal projects are often credited with ensuring Allied victory: breaking the Enigma code, the development of radar, and the atomic bomb. But there was a fourth, a project so secret its budget was one of the largest of the war, costing over $1 billion in 1940s, a staggering sum. It involved the collective genius of America's brightest scientific minds at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. It was called the VT fuse for variable time, a deliberately vague name to hide its true purpose. Today, we know it as the proximity fuse. The concept was simple, but its execution was a feat of engineering. For centuries, artillery shells had 2 ways of going off: on impact or with a timer. Impact fuses were useless against troops in cover. Timed fuses, meant to create airbursts over enemy positions, were better in theory, but incredibly difficult to use. They required precise calculations, and a small error could make the shell explode hundreds of feet too high, or bury itself in the mud. The proximity fuse was designed to solve this problem with breathtaking ingenuity. Inside the nose of each shell was a marvel of miniaturization, a tiny self-contained radar set. It had a radio transmitter, a receiver, an amplifier, a battery, and an explosive trigger. Once fired, the fuse would start emitting radio waves. As the shell neared its target, the waves would bounce off the ground. And when the reflected signal reached a specific intensity, indicating the shell was at the perfect altitude, usually between 30 and 50 feet. It would detonate the main charge. The result was a perfect airburst every single time, without any complex math from the gun crew. It turned a normal artillery shell into an intelligent weapon. An airburst was dramatically more lethal than a ground burst, spraying a wide cone of steel shrapnel capable of reaching soldiers in trenches and foxholes. The technical challenges were immense. The team had to build electronics that could survive being fired from a cannon. The components, including tiny vacuum tubes, had to withstand the shock of 20,000 times the force of gravity and the violent spin of the shell. The batteries had to be designed so that the force of the launch itself would shatter a small glass vial, allowing the electrolyte to activate the power source. It was a billion-dollar gamble on technology many believed was impossible. By 1944, American industry was churning out tens of thousands of these fuses a day, but they came with a strict order. The fuse was to be used only over water as an anti-aircraft weapon. The reason was secrecy. If a dud was recovered by the Germans, they might reverse engineer it. The fear was that Germany could quickly create its own version and use it against Allied bombers, or worse, have it ready for the D-Day invasion. General Eisenhower later said that if the Germans had this weapon at Normandy, the invasion might have been exceedingly difficult, perhaps impossible. So, while the Navy used the fuses with spectacular success in the Pacific and against V-1 flying bombs over Britain, the Army's crates remained off-limits for ground combat, waiting for an emergency so dire that the risk of compromise was worth it. That emergency was about to arrive. On the northern shoulder of the German attack stood the town of Monshaw. Holding this critical anchor of the American line was a small reconnaissance unit, the 38th Cavalry Squadron. Supporting them was the 46th Field Artillery Group, commanded by Colonel Oscar Axelson, a career artilleryman who understood the brutal math of his trade. He also understood the orders he'd been given about the new funny fuse shells, camed POSID. The restrictions were absolute. Do not use them unless authorized by the highest command. On the morning of December 16th, Axelson's world exploded. The German 326th Volt Grenadier Division slammed into the cavalry's thin lines. The calls for fire support grew desperate. The Germans were advancing in huge numbers, using the fog to their advantage. Axelson's gunners fired conventional shells, but the well-trained Germans would just hit the ground, wait for the barrage to pass, and then get up and continue their relentless advance. Axelson faced an impossible choice. His position was about to be overrun, and the men on the front line faced annihilation. Following his orders meant accepting a catastrophic defeat. Breaking those orders meant risking a court-martial and handing America's most important military secret to the enemy. As the reports grew more frantic, Axelson made his decision. He judged that the immediate crisis, the collapse of his sector, outweighed the potential compromise of the fuse. He picked up the field telephone and gave the order. It went against everything he had been told, a direct violation of a directive from Allied Supreme Headquarters. He ordered his gun crews to load the PZ shells. He was gambling his career and $1 billion secret on the belief that this weapon could stop the German assault in its tracks. The men of the 326th Volt Grenadier Division, confident in their attack, were about to walk into a storm of steel unlike anything they had ever experienced. The first salvos of proximity fuse shells were supersonic, arcing invisibly through the snowy air. For the advancing German infantry, there was no warning whistle, just the cataclysmic crack of explosions directly over their heads. The effect was apocalyptic. Instead of hitting the ground, the shells detonated about 30 to 50 feet in the air, raining thousands of lethal steel fragments downwards. Veteran German soldiers conditioned to dive into foxholes to survive artillery found their instincts had become a death sentence. Cover was now useless. The shrapnel tore through them from above, penetrating foxholes and shallow trenches with ease. The very air had turned against them. The attack simply evaporated. Formations that had been advancing with discipline were shredded in seconds. Survivors were gripped by a terror they had never known. They had faced artillery for years, but this was something that seemed almost supernatural. There was no way to defend against it. The German assault on Mancha collapsed. The psychological impact was profound. German prisoners spoke of a new horrifying Allied weapon. Unable to understand how the Americans were achieving such perfect airbursts in a blizzard, Axelson's gamble had paid off spectacularly. Though his decision caused a crisis in the high command, the results were impossible to argue with. On December 21st, General Eisenhower officially lifted the ban. The floodgates opened. 200,000 proximity fuse shells were rushed to artillery units all across the Ardennes. The story of Mona was repeated across the front. In the besieged town of Bastogne, the surrounded 101st Airborne used the fuses to shatter wave after wave of German attacks supported by artillery units like the African-American 969th Field Artillery Battalion. On Christmas Day, General George S. Patton, whose Third Army was racing to relieve Bastogne, witnessed the fuse's power firsthand. Near the Saure River, a German battalion was caught in the open. Patton watched in awe as over 700 German soldiers were killed in minutes. The forest itself, once a German advantage, became a death trap. The airbursts hit the treetops, creating a secondary explosion of wooden splinters that rained down on the soldiers below, compounding the lethality of the shrapnel. One officer reported that the bodies of a German patrol hit by a proximity fuse barrage looked as if they had gone through a meat grinder. The introduction of the proximity fuse was a turning point in the Battle of the Bulge. This channel is all about uncovering these pivotal moments in history. So, if you enjoy deep dives into the secret weapons and untold stories of the past, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Let us know in the comments what other secret weapon of World War II do you think deserves its own story. The widespread deployment of the proximity fuse fundamentally changed the battlefield. For the first 5 days of the offensive, the Germans used the terrible weather to their advantage. The proximity fuse stole that advantage back. Suddenly, darkness and fog were no longer a sanctuary. American artillery could now fire with devastating accuracy at unseen targets, day or night. For the German soldier, the psychological toll was immense. The battlefield no longer had safe spaces. The sound of incoming artillery, once a signal to take cover, now heralded an unavoidable curtain of death. Morale plummeted. Troops began to refuse orders to advance into areas covered by American artillery. German intelligence, despite capturing some duds, failed to grasp the technology. Their own scientists had considered the idea of a proximity fuse, but had dismissed it as technically impossible during the war, a belief that left their troops completely unprepared. The fuse was an incredible force multiplier. It's estimated that proximity fuse shells were responsible for thousands of German casualties during the battle. For an army already stretched to its breaking point, this level of attrition was unsustainable. General George H. Patton became one of the fuse's biggest proponents. After witnessing its effects, he wrote a letter to the Chief of Army Ordnance. In his famously blunt style, Patton declared, "The funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us." He added, "I think that when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare." He was right. The age of simply digging a hole for protection was over. The fuse's impact went beyond just inflicting casualties. It broke the momentum of the German offensive. Elite units that had spearheaded the attack were stalled or decimated. By turning the Germans' greatest assets, the cover of the force, and the bad weather into liabilities, the proximity fuse helped stabilize the front and gave the Allies the time they needed to regroup and launch the counteroffensive that would ultimately destroy the last of Hitler's armored reserves. The Battle of the Bulge ended in a decisive Allied victory, but at a terrible cost. It was the largest and bloodiest single battle fought by the United States in World War II. In the final analysis, it was a battle won not only by the courage of the soldiers, but also by the genius of the scientists. The proximity fuse stands as one of the most significant, yet least known technological triumphs of the war. Its development was a monumental achievement, a secret kept so well that its debut on the battlefield came as a complete and devastating shock. It saved countless Allied lives, first by defending ships from air attack, and then by shattering German ground forces at the most critical moment of the war in Europe. The legacy of that colonel's decision on December 16, 1944, extends far beyond the Ardennes. Colonel Axelson's gamble unleashed a weapon that not only helped win the battle, but also heralded a new age of warfare. The proximity fuse was in essence the world's first smart weapon. The miniaturized rugged electronics developed for it laid the fundamental groundwork for the entire field of modern guided munitions that defines the battlefields of today. The story of the funny fuse is a powerful reminder that history often turns on single moments of innovation and on the courage of individuals willing to take a risk in impossible circumstances. It's the story of how a tiny intelligent device unleashed at the perfect moment made the frozen earth tremble, broke the back of Hitler's last army, and forever changed the way wars are fought. Not if you enjoyed this video and want to see more stories from World War II. make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more forgotten battles, hidden histories, and untold soldier stories to life. And let me know your thoughts in the comments. What event or perspective would you like to see next? I read every comment.